Mm.
To His Majesty King Charles III, on behalf of all of our communities in Ilford South, I've always had a profound respect for the Queen and for the role she has performed in the nation. And in a constituency like Ilford, where people really do God alongside their politics, she has been so fondly in the arms of so many for her religious beliefs and her faith, but also, of course, because of her public service. But she was also an inspiration to our nation, a steadying influence for millions to look up to amid the turbulence and flux so often in British politics. She was the anchor that so many needed during times of crisis.
Good evening, comrades. Welcome to Red Line TV. What we are currently witnessing in all our media, day in, day out, is a reflection of a particular aspect of the class war, I'd say. The monarchy is, as Percy Shelley put it, the string that ties the robber's bundle. The efforts to force us all into national mourning shows how integral to capitalism the monarchy really is. If we can be made to believe that somebody is born to rule over us, then we are probably going to believe anything. Or the other way around, once we start questioning the monarchy's right to rule over us, we might also start questioning a whole lot of other things. That's a real danger for the working class. I think that's why they emphasize constant, the consistency of the monarchy, of the Queen, or as Sam Terry put it so sycophantically, an anchor in society for all of us. But the fact that millions of pounds are being spent on this funeral and some more millions on Charles' coronation next year, and the way the ruling class is going into overdrive to make us love King Charles III, I think it actually shows how weak the monarchy is, how weak the ruling class is at the moment. There is a crisis of monarchy, with many countries in the Commonwealth wanting to become republics. There's a constitutional crisis. There's a huge cost of living crisis. In fact, capitalism has been going from one crisis into the next for many, many years now. It is, as many economists believe, in terminal decline. And now we're also seeing finally perhaps the slow resurgence of the workers' movement, the one class that, according to Marx, can actually do away with capitalism. It's the gravedigger of capitalism. I think there's a big confrontation coming up between the two main classes, the working class and the ruling class. It's coming, that seems quite clear. Graham Bush, you were the editor of Labour Briefing magazine for many, many decades. Do you think there's a confrontation coming? Have you felt something like we're feeling at the moment for a while?
Oh, definitely. I mean, it was good that you started with the monarchy, Tina, but context here is everything. And we're facing an unprecedented economic crisis, but as well, we're facing a political crisis, and it takes so many forms. On the monarchy itself, I think we will see that with the death of Elizabeth, the monarchy, and in fact the ruling class, has lost a really important representative for them. And I think that with Charles, I think the monarchy in perhaps quite a short period will be in decline and in some crises. But the political crisis is also about what's happening to the two major parties. With Truss, I think the Tories have made what is a rare error, but I think it's a decisive one in electing Truss as leader. I think it's a potential disaster for them. It means a crisis, however, not just for the Tories, but for Labour too. Starmer is now more likely than not to form a Labour government within the next 2 years. And this is Starmer who will come to office, if he does, in the midst of this acute economic and cost of living crisis, with no effective programme to solve that crisis in the interest of the workers' movement. And that inevitably means conflict with the trade unions, just at a time of a resurgence of trade union militancy. So the stage is set, I think, for a major conflict between a Starmer-led neoliberal Labour government and the trade unions, a resurgent trade union movement, and that will mean an acute form of class struggle. And I think this period, the period of a Starmer government, could well define the future of the Labour Party and the nature of its historic relationship with the trade unions. So this is my plea. Now is not the time to leave the Labour Party. Now is not the time to step aside from what could be that momentous battle. But just finally, Tina, back to where we started. As I say, the monarchy, after this short period of national unity, is weakened. I think Elizabeth, from their point of view, is irreplaceable. I think Truss is trying to follow in Thatcher's footsteps, but it's a pale, weak version of Thatcher. Ditto Starmer, a pathetic version of Blair. Of both of them, we can say in Karl Marx's famous words, first time as tragedy, second time as farce. So there we have it, Truss, Starmer, Charles III, plus economic and political crisis. I think that's a perfect storm.
A triumvirate of mediocrity, isn't it? Or even less than mediocrity, perhaps. Scraping the barrel with Truss and Starmer for sure. But Starmer is, of course, leading a safe second 11, isn't it? That's his purpose. He is supposed to do what Tony Blair kind of did. He takes over when the Tories can't do it. But we're seeing rebellion even, on a sort of low level against the monarchy. And Mike, you were actually in Edinburgh over the weekend, and you've seen also how that's been reflected in football terms, haven't they? Because actually, let me just say this quickly. The FA has cancelled all matches. There was my daughter's football has been cancelled. So the idea that it's got to do with the police numbers, there's very few police at my daughter's 9 years old football matches. So it's about the working class expressing itself at football matches, isn't it? And in Eton, they carried on playing over the weekend, but not in Edinburgh, did they?
Well, Eton don't need police, do they, for the crisis? The crisis, they are subject to the crisis, we hope, in the next few years. But no, it's an interesting series of events, and I guess I tend to agree with Graham's analysis of the likely pattern of events to come and to unfold over the next couple of years. But it's interesting to look at the portents now. I think the fact that the football was cancelled is a sign of a hemorrhaging of confidence amongst the political classes and amongst the establishment more generally. If they were confident that ordinary people would genuflect as the way they want them to genuflect and to scrape the knee and tip their caps to the spectacle and the pomp and the circumstance, the football would have gone ahead, because the football would have provided some of that spectacle. But they know, we spoke to a Liverpool fan a few shows ago, there is a hardcore left-wing element. They would not have behaved themselves. Up here, with Celtic in particular, who have a Republican tradition and a left-wing support, they would not have behaved themselves. And there was an incident in Edinburgh. There's two big clubs in Edinburgh, Hearts and Hibs. And Hearts are, while they don't necessarily have the kind of loyalist traditions that are associated with Rangers, they do have a small but vociferous right-wing and far right-wing support. A few years ago, just before lockdown, a few of us went up to do some anti-fascist work outside their ground in the west of Edinburgh. Very difficult 1 hour. We were spat at, we had leaflets ripped out our hands, we were physically threatened. Stephen Yaxley Lennon was threatening to come up and join with Common Cause. But at the game last week, when the announcement was made and when the national anthem was played there, it didn't break out into physical violence, but there was a confrontation amongst the Hearts fans from those who were cheering and those who were booing. So these fissures are opening up, and I guess part of the job of us as socialists is to leverage them wider and to see where the contradictions are growing wider, see where the ruling class is becoming weaker and more vulnerable. And yes, I agree absolutely with Graham, with Liz Truss in the political field, in the field of spectacle and pomp and circumstance with King Charles. These are two figures that the ruling class cannot possibly have confidence in to maintain the system at a stable level and a harmonious level, and it could well be that we're looking down the road at the ruling class donning its kid gloves with Keir Starmer and hoping that he can come in and steady the ship a little bit. But as Graham says, steadying the ship inevitably means very sharp conflict with a trade union movement which has said already that they are not prepared to be compliant with a Labour government.
And we want to talk to Terry Conway about this in a bit more detail. Hi, Terry. Thanks for joining us. She's of the Labour Representation Committee, and you've done a bit of research into what's been happening in the last week. It's been a tumultuous week in terms of trade union resistance, which we were so glad that finally something's happening. And then all these strikes get postponed, cancelled, etc. I mean, there's the CWU strike on the day after her death that's been postponed, but it's actually now been confirmed they will go on strike at the end of September and October the 1st. So that's good, and it's kind of understandable. I find it more difficult to understand why, the RMT is postponing its strike, and TSSA is called off their strike September 26, 27. That's a full week after the funeral. What do you make of that, Terry? What's that pressure like on the trade unions at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it was sensible of the CWU to suspend their strike the day after her death. They had been on strike, when the announcement came. And I think we need to remember, I mean, I agree with the comments that you've all made about the weakness of the ruling class in terms of pro-monarchy sentiment, but nevertheless, I don't think we should forget that there are working class people who buy into that, unfortunately. Not all the people who've been lining the streets of Edinburgh, not all the people who've been going to Buckingham Palace are, members of the establishment. And so I think for the CWU to have gone ahead the next day would have been a problem. I think that, as I understand it, the RMT, I've been trying to find out the legal situation. I think, although I've not been able to confirm it, that the fact that the RMT suspended their strike means that they haven't breached the 30-day rule and therefore won't have to reballot. They certainly don't have to reballot on the basis of the length of their mandate for strike action, because the original ballot was on May the 24th, so that lasts till November the 24th, but then you have to take action every 30 days. But I'm assuming that they had the sense to get legal advice and to know that if you talk about suspending action, then it's seen as the same because it's about the number of incidents. I was even more concerned by a meme that was produced by the RMT that had a picture of Elizabeth Windsor on it and was very, and I think there are unfortunately people in the leadership of the RMT who I think do have a tendency to bow to British nationalism in a way that I think is deeply problematic. So that did concern me. But on the other hand, the barristers went ahead and struck on Friday. There was a strike today in Lewisham, a UCU strike, and other trade unionists turning up to support that. The NEU, the National Education Union, is balloting in all the areas of its membership at the minute, or about to. The UCU is balloting. The EIS in Scotland is balloting. There's consultation going on in Scotland about whether the unions, or certainly in Unison, whether Unison accepts the improved offer from the Scottish government to those workers. And I know that Glasgow Unison, which is by far the biggest local government unison, which is by far the biggest branch in Scotland, is recommending rejection of the offer. And I think that together with the dynamic that things like Don't Pay and Enough is Enough have been organising around the cost of living situation more generally and linking up with community groups means that the dynamic isn't going to go away because the material reality continues to hit millions of working class people, you know, every time you look at your bank balance and look at your meters.
Absolutely. And it's, you know, obviously we support those working class struggle, which are at the moment chiefly defensive. You know, I mean, the inflation rate going up 15% perhaps. Of course, we're defending our living standards. Do you are you hoping that something like Enough is Enough and Don't Pay could actually then help the working class to go on the offensive, which is clearly what we need? We actually need to go, you know, further than just defending what we have, but demand more. And political issues as well, isn't it?
I mean, I think Enough is Enough is very interesting because on the one hand, they do have political demands that the British working class and the British trade union movement have been very loath to go beyond. So they do talk about ending food poverty, and they do talk about decent homes for all. And clearly those things are very tied into the cost of living crisis, but there are areas where, you know, maybe trade unions nationally and regionally and locally have affiliated to other campaigns, but they haven't been seen as kind of core trade union issues. I think in many other parts of the world, trade unions have been much more political, but I think the British trade unions have been much more cowed by a division of Labour. That's for the Labour Party. And we just get on with workplace issues. So I see that as a very positive move, particularly by the CWU, which is officially affiliated to Enough is Enough, and pushing that. On the other hand, I'm slightly frustrated that there doesn't seem to be any proper structure where ordinary activists on the ground and even trade union branches can kind of get involved in shaping it. There have been a number of good local initiatives. I know in London, 2 places which had big local meetings last week in Haringey and in Lambeth. Which are kind of allied to all of this, but the national campaign is a bit slow. And I think as well as having the right demands, we also need structures that allow ordinary people to express their views and direct these things, not it all coming from the top.
I mean, in addition to the problems, let's put it like that, of the democratic structures, there are some other problems slowly cropping up, isn't it? I mean, Unite, there's this issue that apparently Sharon Graham says, you know, Unite has not been consulted at the beginning, hadn't been involved properly, and then she kind of done what, you know, trade union bureaucrats sometimes do. Oh, well, we have nothing to do with that. We do our own thing then, and going into perhaps what looks a bit like a sectarian move to set up their own campaign. Also, we're hearing, and I'm not quite sure if that's true or not, but maybe you know more about that. John Rees said that Jeremy Corbyn has actually been denied a platform at Enough is Enough in Manchester, and the left has been kept out of various things. Do you hear if that's true?
I haven't had a chance to follow up on the Corbyn thing. I forgot you'd said that to me yesterday. It went out of my brain. On the Sharon Graham statement, I think you're probably drawing on an article that was in Squawk Box at the end of last week, which purported to report on the United EC. I have to say that I'm one of the people who takes things that are printed in Squawk Box with a large several stones worth of salt. He's not a good journalist. He doesn't source stuff properly. He doesn't refer to his sources, and that's particularly true when it comes to Unite. Steve Walker, like myself, supported Howard Beckett for the leadership of Unite, and for that I don't criticise him. But since Sharon was elected, he's taken, in my view, a very sectarian attitude to the new leadership of Unite. The Unite EC did agree not to affiliate to Enough is Enough, but there was no discussion at the EC. Sharon didn't intervene into the discussion, whereas Steve poses it as this is all Sharon's personal vitriol, which I think is hopeless. And not very useful when we need to be building solidarity with all workers taking action. The EC did decide not to affiliate, and the main argument for that was that there was no structure to properly affiliate to. So they, you know, and there have been Unite members, prominent Unite members, speaking at local meetings organised under the umbrella of Enough is Enough. So I think that those sort of rumours are not helpful. And certainly, I mean, I heard Sharon Graham speak at both the Durham Miners Gala and then at Tolpuddle. And in both cases, it seemed to me that the argument she was making around political trade unionism were very much in line with what Mick Lynch was saying. So, and things that I've heard Dave Ward said very similar things at Durham, and I've heard Dave Ward say since. So I think this attempt to, you know,
there's unfortunately not that much transparency in the trade union movement. Let's put it like that. And there are issues with, you know, those on top of the trade unions who play a similar role sometimes with those on top of the Labour Party, perhaps. And you know, it's not very democratic, often organised in those trade unions. Mike, you wanted to come in.
It was just briefly. I think if a politicisation is going to emerge out of these current disputes, and it is going to assume a political direction that we can get behind, and that obviously with Enough is Enough, and other portents of that, this is happening already. But the critical thing is we've got to win these disputes. That's critical. If these disputes are lost, the momentum and the impetus will go. So while I see in the chat box some criticism of the UCW and others for suspending the disputes, and I initially was sceptical of that decision, but I probably err on the side of Terry's position now that it was kind of unavoidable, given the kind of optics and of the moment. But I think whatever we think about that, Dave Ward, Mick Lynch and the rest are not monarchists. They took a strategic decision, which we can either support or not support on that basis. But it's our responsibility, I think, fundamentally and primarily, to initially get behind these disputes and ensure that they win, because without that confidence, without that impetus, whatever politics emerge out of these struggles is going to be a less transformative politics, a less militant politics than we would like. So confidence builds expectations. Expectations build good politics. And if people lose battles, we all know this, their expectations are lowered. What they believe is possible becomes managed either by the trade union bureaucracy or elsewhere. And of course, just from a purely a trade union principle point of view, in the tough times that we all know are out there and Terry was describing, we desperately want people to win better terms, conditions and better wages for their members. Once secured, and that powerful lesson that we can win even in the face of a Labour Party that is not just indifferent to the disputes, but is actually hostile to them, never mind the right-wing press and the Tories and so on, and employers. That is a powerful, powerful lesson. As we always say, an ounce of experience is worth a ton of theory. And if we can win these disputes, then we can begin to see, hopefully, the emergence of a much more enduring confidence amongst the working class that they can build political alternatives to what we have now.
We do have a problem, though, don't we, Graham? And that is a problem of political representation for the working class. So we've got the unions doing something, but the Labour Party is going in the opposite direction. How do you see this relationship between the unions and the Labour Party developing over the next period?
Well, I think, as Mike said, so much depends on the outcome of the current and next disputes. Because if we lose those, then we will lose that momentum. But I think, look, I mean, there's always been a problem in a sense with political representation. In fact, I remember when the Labour Representation Committee was set up, 20 years ago, it was on the basis of what Tony Benn said, that actually there's a crisis of representation and the working class was not represented. Now, there was a short interregnum under Jeremy, where there was the beginnings of a resurgence of working class representation. But it really didn't get that far in terms of the Parliamentary Labour Party, which is totally unrepresentative of the Labour movement. And it's what I think I indicated when we first started. I think that there is a collision course coming between a Starmer right-wing Labour government. It'll be the most right-wing Labour government in history if it happens, in my opinion, and hopefully, and we don't know this, a resurgent trade union movement. And that will be an acute form of class struggle between the two wings of the movement, between the Labour Party and the trade unions. And I think that will define the question which so many people are talking about. Is the Labour Party finished? Is it still a Labour Party? Too early to say. It's certainly not business as usual. This is different from the Blair years. Blair didn't have to break that relationship with the trade union movement. Starmer may be, from his own point of view, in a time of economic crisis, wedded as he is to the establishment, forced to actually take on the trade unions. And if he does, if the trade unions fight back, then everything's up for grabs. And that historic relationship between the Labour Party and the trade unions may alter. Nothing exists forever. So for the moment, given, in my opinion, that impending tension and conflict, it is madness to actually talk about leaving the Labour Party just at this moment, which doesn't mean to say that the centre of our orientation is in constituency Labour parties. It isn't. The centre of our orientation is in the trade union movement, in the climate change, in the struggle against racism, all these extra parliamentary fights. And our task is to try to give them political representation. And I think my position is within the Labour Party if we may, outside if we must. So it's all to be decided. And it's too early to say a definitive break has yet occurred. It's in the offing, but it hasn't yet happened.
Terry, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, Naomi has been elected, Naomi Wimborne-Odrissi, onto the NEC, a great victory, I think, for the anti-witch hunt left. Let's see if she can actually, how long she'll last before she gets expelled. 30,000 people voted for left-wing candidates, which is, you know, that's a good result. I mean, there's not as many as there were in the Labour Party, but still, that's still more socialists inside the Labour Party, perhaps, than outside in the little groups that exist. I mean, considering the electoral system as it is, it just leads to, you know, it ferments splitting on the left, doesn't it? What do you say to people who say we should you know, ask unions to disaffiliate from the Labour Party and build a new party? What kind of party?
Yeah, I think that's a real mistake at the minute for some of the reasons that Graham said. I mean, I also think that in terms of the political dynamics, I think, you know, unfortunately, well, I can't see people on the call, so there are people here I don't know, but of the people that I know, where most of us are not very in the first flush of youth, I think one of the things that's, some of us may be still in the second flush, Tina, some of us are beyond that. But I think one of the things that's been interesting and important to me on the picket lines I've managed to get to and the meetings I've managed to get to around the strikes this summer has been the number of people I've talked to who've been on strike for the first time, has been the level of picketing completely in defiance of the trade union laws, I'm glad to say. Far more than 6 people on every picket line I've been on, more than 60 on some of them. And that's really important because for lots of young people, they've not had the experience of trade unions winning something. And that, I think, really makes Mike's point even more strongly. You know, those people who have won something in the past are more loyal to trade unions because they know that they can achieve something. If you've just joined a union and you get beaten, then it's much harder for people to stay active and see the point. But I think you can see a politicization of the trade union movement in terms of not saying, oh, that's all for Labour, at the same time as maintaining affiliation in most cases, although of course the RMT disaffiliated along, or actually was thrown out when it supported the SSP in Scotland many years back. And so is not an affiliated union, and some of the other unions that are taking balloting for action, like the NEU and the UCU, are not affiliated. Although many of their members are Labour Party members. But yeah, I think this is absolutely the wrong time for people to leave, although of course some of those that we've lost have not been through their choice, but have been because people have been witch hunted out, and we should forget that.
Yeah, and with the politicization of the trade unions has to come a democratization of the unions as well, because that is a huge problem that the normal members don't actually have much say over what's going on. Talking about the class war, and we're saying that there is a confrontation coming up. The ruling class is quite aware of that, and that's of course why they've been tightening laws. We're going to talk to 2 more speakers later about this, but they're also attacking the rights of the trade unions to go on strike, etc. I mean, the British anti-trade union laws are some of the strictest in the developed Western world already. And Liz Truss has promised to come in and have another go. So for a matter of here, they're looking at the 48-hour maximum week. You know, it's obvious, you know, the longer you work, the better your quality of work will be. How breaks are calculated, holidays and holiday pay, etc. What else do they have in stock for us?
Yeah, well, I mean, and I guess the other thing that's worth talking about that's already happened is what happened with P&O over fire and rehire, where they said, well, it's illegal, but we can't do anything about it. And you know, so it's like, if you know, the woman protester in Edinburgh yesterday who was arrested for holding well, you showed it in the clip at the beginning, charged with breach of the peace, I understand. I haven't heard happened in court today. So, you know, if a working class person breaks the law in even the smallest way, we're hauled up before the courts. But if the bosses break the law, even where they haven't managed to bend the law so that they don't find them guilty, they say they're not going to do anything about it. I mean, one of the big things which they talked about doing at the beginning of the RMT, ASLEF and TSSA strikes, which they haven't done yet, was amending the bit of the act that says you can't bring scabs in, that makes it illegal to employ scabs. Now, I think they backed off partly because they immediately, when the transport unions went on strike, partly because I think they saw the level of public support for the strikes, which has been massive, but also because I think their own advisors said, don't be fucking stupid. You'll kill people if you employ people without any training to drive trains. I mean, you know, or do the health and safety stuff or whatever. But I think they will try and do that. I think they're also talking about increasing the amount of notice you have to give, decrease. One of the things they've talked about is having to ballot every time you take another incident. So at the minute, a ballot is live for 6 months, so long as you use it every 30 days. And they're saying, well, a ballot can be live for 6 months if you take 6 months continuous strike action, which they know that at the minute people don't have the confidence to do. But if you go out for 1 day, then you have to reballot, which is, of course, completely absurd and ridiculous.
Like a strike against or industrial action against those kind of attacks on us would also, you know, politicize the struggle against this government and their plans. Graham, Mike, have you got any other questions for Terry?
No, I think that Terry and Mike dealt with all the real issues very well.
Yeah, and we've got one person actually who's got their hand up. Jenny, do you want to come in quickly in this? Hi.
I just want to pick up just very briefly on something that Terry said and also Graham, which is about the age of people who are at this meeting and what that means. I just want to share, when I first started work, on my first day at work, which was, 46 years ago, the first thing I did was sign up to NUPE, and was an active trade unionist ever since. And the whole of my team was in a trade union. We're unionized. By the time I retired, as a manager, I was the only bloody person in a union, right? And I remember when the Tory party had its national conference in Birmingham, and as a manager, I suggested to my team that we all go out with a banner and join the protest against the Tories, which was rather strange, as none of them were in a trade union, and I was the only one who'd suggested it. And there were lots of young people in the team, and they'd never been on strike before, and a lot of them had never been on a protest and literally didn't know what to do. You know, it was a real learning experience. And so alongside that was kind of also why it's important to join the picket line as supporters, you know, this whole Sam Tarry thing. And why it's what it feels like to be on a picket line, and when people who aren't in your union turn up to it and join it. And I just think there's a big sort of, I don't know how we sort of try and get those sorts of ideas across and over to those who have lived through, since the miners' strike, lack of, you know, any direct action of any consequence. And it's about trying to re-energize younger people and to understand what it feels like, you know. That's all I want to say.
Thanks, Comrade. Mike.
It was just to pick up, Tina, and something Jenny said there. I suspect it's maybe been the same on picket lines around the country, but the picket lines I've been on have included Live and Rent, who are a tenants union, very militant direct action tenants union, mainly for young people. There's been anti-raids organisations, anti-racist organisations. So to pick up Jenny's point, the disputes have broadened beyond the immediate terms, conditions and pay for a lot of people. They see these disputes as having a political context. You don't have to tell them they have a political context, which is interesting. And if we can sustain that, an interesting thing, I think, and an area of encouragement for us all, is the amount of enemies that the ruling class are picking up right now. When they start to lash out at civil liberties, at closing down avenues of legitimate protest, because they are fearful of the future, and let's be honest, the system's been very volatile and extremely unstable for 20 years now, since the banking crisis, and they know they've got a problem. And as Graham and others are saying, electing Liz Truss and anointing King Charles is not going to make their problems go away, very far from it. So I think one of the encouraging things and things that we can draw hope from is the amount of people being drawn into these struggles. I mean, if barristers, for goodness sake, are going on strike and you know, for a brief and glorious moment with the vanguard of the working class on last Friday, then something is going on. And it is drawing in young people who I think were radicalised by Corbyn. And that project went, and they have looked, certainly it's up here, I know lots of people who left the Labour Party, and I would agree with Graham, they did so prematurely, but they had an incredible experience at that moment, and it didn't stop them, even though they left the Labour Party, leaving left-wing politics. They looked for other channels, and they're seeing these disputes as an opportunity to rejoin the fray.
Yeah. Terry.
Yeah, just some bits and pieces. Jenny and I are actually in the same union branch, even though we live in different countries. And one of the things that Unite Community is talking about doing is actually trying to get into schools to talk to young people about trade unionism, which I think would be really useful and important. Secondly, it's one of the reasons why I think the campaigns around the cost of living, for example, Enough is Enough, for example, includes Acorn, which has grown as a very powerful organisation, very much driven by younger people, the private rented sector, the football fans for food banks dynamic again is very much, it's not just your daughter who plays football.
Yeah.
Clearly there's a generational dynamic there. So I think it's really good that those things are happening. And I think the final thing is that those of us who are active trade unionists, and indeed those of us who were in the Labour Party, need to make sure that when those groups call their own protests, we're there visibly as part of the Labour movement with our banners and with our flag, so that we're having those conversations and that political coming together.
Also strikes me that something from our history could be revisited, which is the National Unemployed Workers Movement, which will become a problem again. I think we're seeing what we're having at the moment is a tight labor market. There's actually very little unemployment at the moment, and some of these laws that are going through and attacks on the unions are designed, I believe, to loosen it, i.e. to create more unemployment so that you can lower wages and have people in competition with each other. And a lot of people at the moment, are not in work still, or, work from home, etc., or do, care work. That's still work, but it's not necessarily paid. So we also have to take a look at those people. Thank you very much, Terry, for joining us. I thought it was a very interesting conversation to be revisited, I think, because this is an ongoing battle for sure. Thanks, Terry. See you soon.
No problem.
We are now pleased to have with us Asa Winstanley, investigative journalist for the Electronic Intifada, investigative journalist. Thank you very much for joining us, Asa. You've done an interesting report about how the media is totally controlling how we report the death of the Queen, even to the point of, as you described, and we don't have to go into too much detail now, but that they kept it secret for many, many hours. And that was quite obvious. Everybody who's watching the news, you could tell for hours there's something happening. They're not releasing it. It's all really tightly controlled. And this kind of total control of media is you've noticed that beyond reporting on the monarchy, haven't you, in recent months and years?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think I just thought that was a really sort of telling and almost symbolic detail of the BBC knew the Queen had died, and you'd think if they were loyal to what they actually claimed to be, of being a critical media, independent, media outlet, which is not actually controlled by government, even though obviously we know that it is, that they would release that fact that the Queen had died. But no, they left it to be announced by the family, because it was all part of controlling the narrative. I just thought that was an interesting detail.
And everybody who watched it thought it was a bit strange, isn't it? You've got these announcements. And as you pointed out, they had black ties on already when she was still apparently with us, etc. It was all very odd. And there's also been reports of social media posts being taken down. I mean, we've seen protesters have been arrested. We're going to talk to that with two other guests, but also social media posts being taken down that are critical of the monarchy, etc. I mean, there is an attack on free speech going on at the moment, which is quite unprecedented, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think this is really hiding the contradictions of that, because we see, I agree with what Graham said about the weakness of this particular new monarch. I mean, I think that it's King Charles is not going to be someone who's we've just seen it already. Even when I think he's going to be quite. I think he's someone who's not as media savvy as his mother was. And I don't think he has which is good from our point of view, really. I mean, I think it is going to become more and more clear just of how to the masses, really, of just how antiquated this establishment is, and I think it's something that is going to just lead to more divisions on the issue, and is going, it's contradictory, because there's kind of pressing the issue, because we've seen all these, and today, and there's a lot of people talking about it in the chat. I know you're going to talk about it more, about people being arrested just for very simple protests, just saying. And I do wonder if we're going to see online platforms cracking down on expressions of republicanism more.
Yeah, and I mean, there's what role will the online safety bill play in that kind of attempt to control the narrative, you think? Can you describe to us what's in the safety bill and why you oppose it?
Well, the increasing controls, giving these social media giants control over what we are and aren't allowed to post online, I think is just a terrible precedent, basically. Taking things down off the internet because the government doesn't agree with them. I mean, it's obviously something that we need to oppose, because we need to have maximum expression of free speech to be able to, carry out these kind of class struggles. It remains to be seen, I guess, the new Prime Minister and the new government will do. They're talking about changing it and watering it down. We'll see. I mean, it's likely to still be incredibly repressive. So I think there's a lot still up in the air at the moment. So we'll have
Yeah,
to
I
wait
think
and
Liz
see.
Truss says she wants to make sure that free speech is protected, which is, I think, in the same way that the Daily Mail is on a campaign for free speech. That means free speech for them, and you know, those kind of nutters, please, can we have them shut up? That kind of free speech, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, Graham, Mike, do you have any questions for Asa? Thank you very much, Asa. We'll be talking again soon, undoubtedly, when they're trying to shut you up, cut you back, shut you down. Thank you very much, Asa. See you soon. Okay, we're now very pleased to be joined by Freya Lockley and Emily Apple, who have both met at a festival and was very taken with their positions and their views on the various bills that they have in stock for us. Hi, this is hi, Freya Lockley. You are anti-capitalist researcher at Corporate Watch, and I'm going to bring in Emily Apple now as well. And there she is. Just a second. Sorry, Jackie is poorly. I should have mentioned that earlier, because normally it's two of us doing all the technical bits, and so it's just me today. Hiya, very nice to see you both. And we've just briefly talked about the online safety bill. Have you heard what they're trying to, you know, tweak or improve on that bill? Because I doubt it's going to be any good.
Specifically on the online safety bill. And it's one of those classic Tory pieces of legislation that's billed as something that will be great for everybody. But basically what it's allowing the government to do is it will have a greater role in deciding online content. And as we know, that's going to benefit the mainstream media. And I think it's been touched on, and it will probably be touched on again. The establishment media is another huge form of control and growing ever more out of control by the moment.
And before I get to Emily, I'm going to just quickly share this, because we've talked about it before. Here, I was quite surprised, I have to say. I don't recall Republican protesters, unless they, you know, actually made a huge noise or whatever, being arrested. So there was at least 2 occasions of where protesters were arrested over the weekend for, you know, she was holding up that banner, and the other guy, I think in Oxford, was shouting, "Who elected him?" And the police came onto him and tackled him. That is quite worrying, isn't it?
Well, it is and it isn't. It's disgusting, but it's not new. We've seen this every time we've had a royal event. In 2002, I was arrested for having a bollocks to the Jubilee sticker. No charges were pressed, but in 2002, we had 40 anti-monarchists arrested for sitting in a pub after having gone to a demonstration. During the royal wedding, we had people dressed as zombies who were sitting in having a coffee for a zombie flash mob, who were arrested. And that case, along with someone else who was just tackled to the ground because the police knew him, that case went all the way to Europe, and they found that the police did act proportionately in arresting them to prevent a breach of the peace because of the intelligence that they held on these people. And it's what we see over and over again, and it's what we talk about a lot in terms of what the work we do at Netpol in this new legislation, in that the police abuse the powers they've already got. They've already got a huge amount of powers that they can use. These arrests weren't under the new legislation. But I think it's really important to put it in that context of when there are things like these royal events, we are regularly seeing this kind of repression of anti-monarchists. And that doesn't make it right, and it doesn't make it good. But I'm sort of looking at these things, I'm going, yeah, that's been going on for a long time.
Even just for holding a placard. I thought that was, yeah. Okay, well, I'm maybe too naive.
One thing that is also really, really worrying is that Simon Hill, who was the one who was arrested in Oxford and then de-arrested, the police, basically, if you read his account, didn't know what was going on. And they claimed it was the new Police Crime Sentencing in Courts Act that he was arrested under, which is legally absolute rubbish. it wasn't. It was a previous Section 5 public order that would have been the case for arresting, but the police didn't actually know. And similarly with the royal weddings, they were literally cleansing the streets around Windsor of homeless people. No, it's nothing new that they will come down to try and promote the glory that we're meant to allegedly see in the monarchy.
So Freya, you've done some work on those various bits of legislation that are coming our way. Some of them have already been written into law. Some others are being tweaked, etc. And can you describe what, in your view, the purpose of these is in this period now?
I'd say, in no uncertain terms, it's the cover for a coup. I mean, if the coup is enacted, several parts of this legislation are in place. I think if they stormed in and announced the full effect of the legislation they've put through, there'd be uproar, but it hasn't. It's come piece by piece. And taken together, each of them, they're extremely worrying pieces of legislation, but it's when you put the pieces together and look at the picture that we now have, the overall impact of it is absolutely terrifying. So most of the legislation comes through now, and bills are now act. So we've got the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, which is one of the most draconian pieces of legislation for years. I'm sure Emily's going to speak more about that. That's the one that saw huge numbers of people take to the streets and the Kill the Bill demonstrations. It's massive changes to the rights to protest, but it also impacts on Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities. Literally, they can now be criminalised for their very way of living. I'm sure Em's going to speak a bit more about that, but alongside that, we've got the Nationality and Borders Act, which the government can now, they can strip people of their citizenship without them even knowing necessarily. It includes a raft of ways to criminalise and to make the life of people seeking asylum and refugees even further. Things like offshoring, which we've seen with the attempt to move people to Rwanda. It also, you can even be arrested for trying to help people seeking asylum or refugees. And it doesn't stop there. So there's also the Elections Act, which includes mandatory ID checks and disenfranchised around 2 million people. Mostly the people who'd be most impacted by that are working class people, Black and brown people, and people from poorer sections of the community. There's the Online Safety Bill, which is another one which Asa has spoken about. There's also the Judicial Review and Courts Act. Again, that's legislation now, which limits access to judicial review. So if you look at some of the things of just of those three I've mentioned, so Police Crime and Sentencing Bill, Nationality and Borders Act, the Elections Act, if you wanted perhaps to seek ways to look at legislation, so to take something to judicial review, to challenge some of the things that are going to happen to people and are already happening to people under those, it's giving the government more power to prevent those. And it's basically limiting the powers of courts and handing that over to the government. There are also so-called reforms to the Human Rights Act. They want to replace that with a Bill of Rights, which again will be chosen by the government. So it's just piece by piece by piece. Every time we might want to propose something, whether that's through protest or whether through going to the court, we're going to be blocked. There's also the Overseas Operation Act, which if we look at, especially in the wake of the monarchy gone crazy, makes it harder to prosecute crimes abroad. So imperialism is entrenched, colonialism is entrenched. And if you take each of these and put them together, there's a coup. The coup has been enacted. And the other really terrifying thing about these is not one of these pieces of legislation was clearly mentioned in the 2019 manifesto. ID checks under the Elections Act, they were mentioned. Others were alluded to. There were aspects, it was known in the manifesto that they were going to come after Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities, but nothing was mentioned when we went to the last election in black and white that made clear this huge changes in legislative process were going to come through. And I think that's what's terrifying, is each of them on their own. One of these would have been bad enough, but putting them together, whichever way you turn now, they're blocking it. There's a coup, it's happened. And I would say, the gloves are off, the Scooby-Doo masks are off now. We're living in a fascist state.
Well, Emily, and I mean, I'm not sure I would call it a coup. It's we've been trying to talk. Well, we've been talking about that. We believe there's a big confrontation coming up between, you know, the working class and the capitalist class, and these are all legislations perhaps to attempt to stop the working class from rising up. In that sense, you could call it a coup, of course, from above, you know, but not against anybody in particular yet, but a general preparation perhaps of a period when the working class, the left, the people actually start to rise up in large numbers. Emily, what do you think is the most worrying part of that kind of drive?
I think it's the fact that the state is trying to make an environment where people are scared of protesting and they're scared of going out on the streets, and whether that's through trade union action, whether it's through direct action on the climate emergency, or whether it's just peaceful vigils and picketing. Like the amount of people who are contacting us to say, we're having this protest, is it still legal? Now, protest is still legal, and that is really, really important. We still have the right to protest. We're not sure what's happening with the Bill of Rights now, because there's been indications that's going to be dropped. We don't know what's going to happen with the Public Order Bill yet, that's still going through Parliament. So the Public Order Bill was there were a lot of amendments that were inserted in the Lords on the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, and they include a suspicionless stop and search power for locking on. They include these new serious disruption prevention orders that basically ban people from seeing each other, from going online and organising online. And they're so draconian, and it's placing protest in the same framework as terrorism or serious organised crime. And those kind of orders on those issues are wrong anyway, but let alone then applying that to protest. So we've got this whole climate where the government wants us to be scared of taking to the streets at a time where we need people to take to the streets. And it's because they know what's coming, they can see what's coming, and they're scared of our power. And so I think it's really, really important to keep talking about the fact that protest is legal, that we still have those rights, and we still have those rights under Articles 10 and 11 for sort of freedom of assembly, for getting out onto the streets. And so it's why with Netpol we started this Defend Dissent campaign, to look at how we protect ourselves on the streets and how we sort of take care of each other, because I think that's going to be needed more and more and more. And getting over this fear, and getting over the fact that the government wants us to be subdued. So what do we do about it? How are we creative about it? How do we get out there and we do these things? I think is really important.
Yeah, which is of course a sign of weakness, isn't it? As you say, they know things are coming and they are feeling their weakness. We've got a couple of people with a hand up, including Asa. I'm just going to bring him in again. Do you want to say something on this issue, Asa?
I just wanted to say, just quickly, really interesting to hear from Freya and Emily. I remember some of those. I mean, she's absolutely right, of course, that, you know, these kinds of just completely ridiculous arrests have been happening for many, many years. And I remember some of those cases, you know, the Jubilee, I believe they were anarchists who were arrested. These kind of arrests have been happening for a long time. But I mean, just an observation really, that I think they're far more noticeable this time. They're far more mainstream, strangely enough. And I think part of the reason for that is actually Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, I think it's like widely known that he is a Republican, and so the leader of the opposition being a Republican gave it a kind of institutional credibility. And there's although there is still, if you believe all the polls, there is still quite a big majority in favour of the monarchy as an institution. It's that majority is getting less and less quite rapidly. And when I researched my most recent piece, I looked at the polls, just a couple of polls, not in depth, most recent ones. And among 18 to 24-year-olds, it's now roughly even between a republic and a monarchy. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting times.
Between 30 and 50%, I think it varies, but depending on what the situation is. You know, if Prince Andrew is in the news a lot, then it tends to go up, etc. We need kind of more.
But this is the thing, like the monarchy has these multiple crises that are not going to go away. You know, of course, there's the things we all know about, Prince Andrew and the sexual abuse, and, you know, Harry and Meghan, but also, you know, the Caribbean country, the West Indian countries, which are, you know, have breaking away from the
Australia, even bigger.
Yeah.
That's going to be a huge thing if the referendum this time is successful. Leah, you want to come in?
Thank you. I actually put my hand up a while ago, and to some extent we've moved on, but I just want to say I'm absolutely fascinated by what Freya and Emily had to say. But why I put my hand up was because I felt that we're missing the fact that they're doing this very blatantly. They're telling us what's going on. It's not just the legislation, hugely important. And if you compare with just for a minute or two, maybe a minute, has anybody actually looked at the wording of the proclamation? So all this stuff we're hearing about continuity, yes, service, that's all we keep hearing about. The actual words, I won't read all of them, it's quite short, that's now been read out by Labour councillors, Labour mayors all around the country. It's embarrassing, you know, drumped up in all the pomp and circumstances of their own medieval gear. So blah, 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 blah. So after the death of the Queen, we therefore, the Lords spiritual and temporal of this realm and members of the House of Commons, blah, 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 blah. Well, no, it's not blah, blah, blah. Together with other members of her late Majesty's Privy Council and representatives of the realms and territories, aldermen and citizens of London and others, do now hereby, with one voice and consent of tongue and heart, honestly, publish and proclaim that Prince blah, blah, blah is now, by the death of our late sovereign, blah, 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 become our only lawful and rightful liege lord, Charles III, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, and of his other realms and territories, King, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith, to whom we do acknowledge all faith and obedience with humble affection, beseeching God, by whom kings and queens do reign, to bless his majesty with long and happy years to reign over us. And I think in all the pomp and pageantry that people still get quite excited about, this medieval or post-medieval nonsense, those are the actual words that were proclaimed all around the country over this weekend. They're almost the right of kings, obedience, reigning over us. So it's in plain sight. So that's I just really think sometimes it's worth reading what they're actually saying.
It's also pretending that monarchy is a natural thing. It's always been there, like capitalism. Has it really? You know, it's very modern. Both are very modern.
And of course, when you start looking at the history and you realize the battles that went on between different families and the complete, not only is an accident of birth that Charles is king, but it's an accident of birth that their family were in the fray all together. And I think it's really important to sort of remember those words when we keep hearing about service. There's nothing in the proclamation of to be of service to the people. Yeah. And to remembering this, we're being told it's a formal thing that every police officer, every soldier, every MP, every prime minister, etc., gives their allegiance not to us, the people, not even to Parliament, but to the Queen and the Crown.
Yep.
So I think that's hugely important. But I know I'm sorry I took a bit of a step back, but I just felt that we've missed all that. And the only other point, and obviously others want to speak, is I hope, if not today, that another point, what we the desperate need for unity, the desperate need for the left in particular, and the failure of the left to actually work together. You know, we talked a little bit earlier about Enough is Enough and other movements. We have got to start forgetting our differences over particular issues, and get that we have a common interest in defeating not only the Tories, but this pernicious system. Therefore, I will now stop because I know you've got lots. Thank you so much for giving me so much time.
Thank you. I think while you were talking, also, actually, I'm going to share something quickly on screen from Loki, which is kind of interesting in terms of, you know, the monarchy is neutral and doesn't get involved in politics, and that's what the Queen did so well. Did she really? We don't hear about it. They don't have to use the royal prerogative and, you know, stop laws being passed. The way they're doing it is these laws are being sent to the palace before they're being discussed in Parliament, before parliamentarians see it. And then the Queen and the palace and her employees, or the, you know, now the King, can actually, you know, get involved and say, no, we don't like that. We don't like that. We don't want the equalities law to be, for example, to be used for us. So we don't have to, you know, we can carry on discriminating against minorities, which they did. That's quite a famous one. But Loki has also pointed out how many laws they were actually getting involved in.
I think the other thing that's important as well is that Simon Hill, who was arrested in Oxford, all he asked was, "Who elected you?" That was it. That's all he did. And another woman today she wasn't arrested. She was moved by the police for simply holding up a placard that said, "Not my king." And the other thing, I don't know if this has been mentioned, is there's the royals don't have to pay inheritance tax. So there's a loophole that means in the face of this huge cost of living crisis we're going through, they don't have the 40% inheritance tax. So just on an economic factor as well, I think we're in for interesting times, because this is coming as most people are having to make choices about whether to stay warm or to feed themselves.
It's tradition not to publish the royals' inheritance payments, etc. It's tradition. It's nothing to do with, you know, keeping secret how many billions they've accumulated. Over
and there's no inheritance tax. There's a loop.
Yeah,
they don't, normally people with that level of wealth would have 40% inheritance tax. The royals don't have it.
Yeah. Any last words from you, Emily, before we?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on a couple of things very quickly. One, what Asa was saying about the Corbyn movement sort of amplifying what's happening now. And I think it's more the grassroots kill the bill movement. I think it's because we've had such a sort of mass sort of uprising of people in terms of talking about the law on protest, that there's a lot of people talking about our right to protest that wouldn't normally be talking about the right to protest. So it's sort of really sort of taken off. And I think we owe that movement a lot in terms of the discussions that are being had now about protest. But I also wanted to talk about this unity, and I think that is so important. And one of the sort of points of our Defend Dissent campaign is around collective solidarity. The state always uses divide and rule. That's how they get us every single time. And we need to fight that. And we need to sort of work out how we work together and have that collective solidarity. And that has to apply to the streets. It has to apply to not labeling like good protesters and bad protesters, violent protesters and non-violent protesters. We need to find these ways of working together and build that collective solidarity between us. Because between all of us, we are strong and we've got this. But every time we get divided, we are weakened. And that's, I think that's one of our biggest battles in terms of the left, is finding that unity and using that strength.
Absolutely. Emily, you mentioned earlier that you're publishing advice on how to, when you go on a demonstration, etc. If you have any links you could put in the chat and also send it to me, and we can send it out to people who've registered for this meeting. A very useful thing. Thank you both very much for joining us. We're coming to the end of our program now. I know there's some people who've got their hands up, but we'll getting to the end of the program. We have a program next week, Have Your Say. So we're inviting comrades to bring up issues that they think we're missing from today. Graham, Mike, what do you think about the discussion we've had today? Do we have a coup coming up? Graham, go on.
Well, whether it's a coup or not, let's leave that one. But what I haven't said much because I've been listening and learning from all of the speakers. I thought I'd say thank you to all of them. In fact, when Emily and Freya were speaking about the attacks on civil liberties, the government and state clamped down on us, it made me think of the Labour Party as well. It's been mirrored in the Labour Party in the last few years. And I think that we can only draw strength from the potential weakness of our opponents. They're in crisis. The monarchy, believe it or not, in this period when there's this so-called national outpouring, is going to be in a growing crisis, in my opinion. As I said, I think Elizabeth for them is irreplaceable. And I think that Charles is actually going to preside over a decline in the monarchy. But a bigger issue is this government. And perhaps that's something we've got to really concentrate on. Its program is horrific, not just the attacks on civil liberties, it's the increase in defense, it's the tax handouts that they're giving, especially to the rich. And when they talk about small state, let's be clear what it means. It means an attack on public services. All of this, together with the cost of living crisis, in which they're having, despite her Truss's comment of no handouts, doing exactly the opposite, to the tune of £150 billion or so, it doesn't add up. And it means a confrontation, I think, with the forces of resistance. And once again, I think it means the probability, not certainty, because Starmer can still snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, but it means the probability of a Labour government coming to office in a couple of years' time in an acute economic crisis and attacking the trade union movement. And that is going to be a critical moment for our future. And our job now is to use every moment we can to prepare for what is happening in front of us. It's critical times indeed. And thank you all for the speakers for certainly teaching me something today. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, I'd echo that entirely. It's been a really informative meeting. I think what we're hearing tonight, and it's frightening in some ways, it's sobering in some ways, but it also, as Graham says, should give us confidence that our enemies are in disarray to a degree. We're seeing different ways in which they are choosing to police the crisis, as we used to talk about, and very draconian ways, as Emily and Freya were describing. But one of my favourite writers, Gary Young, in an article about the Iraq war protests many years ago, said, look, we lost that battle. But what we achieved at that point was a long-term victory. People learn very, very powerful lessons about the politics of colonialism, of so-called liberal interventionism and so on, and it stood us in very strong stead for the future. And I think that there's two things to take away to give us confidence tonight. The Corbyn project, and certainly the Kill the Bill protest that Emily was mentioning, have been a very powerful political education for an awful lot of people. And there are big struggles coming during which that political education can be applied. And one narrative and one positive perhaps to finish on is to counterpose our solidarity with their solidarity. All this week, they've been trying to impose a form of a colonial solidarity on us around about the divine right of kings and queens to rule over us. And Leah's recitation was also instructive. We have a form of solidarity, and it's a much more powerful form of solidarity because the numbers are with us. We are the many, they are the few. And we have a solidarity around the ambitions which they cannot hope to match, of equality and human dignity and social justice, and a confrontation and an addressing of the climate crisis, which of course that's a crisis we've not even mentioned tonight. So our solidarity is much more powerful and has much finer ambitions in mind, and if we can keep articulating that and counterposing that to their impositions of a false solidarity with our enemies and systems and institutions that are contrary to our own interest, then I think we can look forward with confidence.
Thank you very much. It's certainly a very, very fluid period, a political period where anything could happen almost, where we could have a minority Labour government, a very right wing, which sees an explosion of the left going forward, building something better than we've seen before, maybe a democratic, even on a principle politics. That would be nice to have that kind of unity. Anything can happen in this period, and it's really important we carry on discussing with an open mind and with free speech secured. And on that manner, I would like to point out that Red Line is supporting Future of the Left conference in Liverpool. I'm just putting the link in the chat now. That's happening at the same time as Labour Party conference, which seems to be going ahead, not being cancelled yet. We're meeting with Craig Murray, Stella Assange, Jackie Walker will be there, Andrew Feinstein, Graham Bush, my good self, maybe Mike will be there. I don't quite know, but there's lots of people coming to discuss the future of the left. And we don't platform anybody. We believe in free speech. We've had pressure to de-invite certain people because their position is controversial, but we're not having it. We believe that it's really important to have these debates out in the open, because if we want to ever get close to socialism, we need to learn to encourage debate and to hear different viewpoints. The working class is not going to be convinced of the need for socialism if we prohibit certain views and say they're beyond the pale, etc. We hope you join us in Liverpool. You can buy your tickets there. And we hope you join us next week on Monday when we're discussing these issues we've raised today with more audience participation. We had a little bit of it, but we didn't have time to let everybody in. Thank you very much, comrades. Have a good evening and see you soon. Thanks for joining.